In 1824, Europe was enjoying a period of stability after the upheaval of the Napoleonic Wars, which had ended less than a decade earlier on the field at Waterloo. In music, it was the year of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and Schubert's Octet. In Britain, Lord Byron's death in Greece was widely mourned. The National Gallery was founded in London, the forerunner of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution was inaugurated, and Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, published the first posthumous edition of her husband Percy Bysshe Shelley's poetry. Bath was still one of Britain's major cities, with a population of 50,000. But its heyday as a resort for the upper classes was fading. Bathing at the seaside was all the rage now. So when Bath's oldest assembly rooms, between the Abbey and the River Avon, were gutted by fire, a vigorous campaign was mounted to replace them with a temple of learning for residents and visitors. The building that rose from the burnt-out shell of the lower assembly rooms during 1824 was designed specifically for its role as Bath's literary and scientific institution. Throughout 1824, its founders drew up regulations and raised funds from subscribers and Bath Corporation. £900 was allocated to the institution's library. The Marquess of Lansdowne, a major Whig politician and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, became the first president. Other prestigious support was enlisted, including from the Duke of Clarence. Later, as King William IV, he would confer patronage from the Crown, so that the institution could add royal to its name. Queen Victoria subsequently confirmed the honour. The building that opened in January 1825 boasted a portico, a laboratory, 2 libraries, a lecture room and an exhibition room for a museum. An inaugural lecture on Bath's scientific heritage was followed by a sumptuous dinner. A collection of important books, historical artefacts and scientific specimens was started, growing rapidly with the help of donations from individuals and organisations. In 1825, the Bath and West Agricultural Society passed on its mineral collection, and 2 years later the Corporation of Bath deposited its Roman antiquities. As the institution grew in prestige, a diverse lecture programme was offered, such as elocution, poetry, Stonehenge, phrenology, geology, botany, optics, coins, French literature and comparative anatomy. And in 1834 the institution laid out its botanical gardens beside the Avon, in what is now Parade Gardens. In the following years the museum continued to develop, with the addition of an ornithological taxidermy collection of more than 1,000 items, a notable mineral collection, and thanks to Charles Moore, a fossil collection that included 32 ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and a number of type specimens from which previously unknown species were described. From 1856, in a demonstration of its public value, the museum was opened 3 days a week, devoted to the free use of the working classes. In the same decade, the eminent natural historian, the Reverend Leonard Jennings, friend and collaborator of Charles Darwin, began his 40-year involvement. Jennings donated 2,000 natural history volumes, original manuscript observations and preserved specimens, as well as valuable correspondence from Darwin and other leading contemporary scientists. In 1864, when the institution hosted the first meeting in Bath of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, the explorer Dr. David Livingstone spoke of his travels in Africa. He's pictured here with colleagues on a field trip organised by Charles Moore. Facilities were also provided for outside specialist groups, many of which published their proceedings. The collection expanded, with additions ranging from the ethnographic souvenirs of Victorian travellers and the memorabilia of Crimean War veterans, to the Reverend Francis Lockie's photographs of Bath from the 1850s. After the city corporation opened the Roman bath to the public in 1897, the institution returned items placed in its care 70 years before, while retaining and expanding its own Roman collection. Around the turn of the 20th century, the institution continued to attract pioneering spirits such as traveller, artist and archaeologist Adela Breton, pictured here in Mexico. A new challenge came in 1932 when Bath Corporation demolished the original building in Terrace Walk to make way for road improvements. Treasures that had attracted almost 14,000 visitors only the year before were hastily packed and moved to new premises in Queen Square. The Second World War left its mark on Bath in many ways, and the institution was directly affected when in 1940 the Admiralty took over the building at Queen Square. The curator was given just 48 hours to pack up the books and collection for storage. The Admiralty did not leave until 1959, when Bath Corporation became the sole trustee. Some of the collection returned as Bath's Geology Museum, and later the City Reference Library shared the building, which came under the control of Avon County Council in 1974. Crucial to preserving the institution's collection was Ron Pickford, a Bath-born former serviceman who was appointed as curatorial assistant and rescued large parts of it from terrible neglect. He ensured proper curation and conservation until his retirement in 1985. Happily, the standards he set have been maintained ever since. When the reference library moved to the new podium building, a proposal to disperse the collection and dispose of the Queen Square premises drew sustained and vociferous opposition. By 1988, a group called the Friends of BRLSI Literary and Scientific Institution had formed. Eventually, the institution's future was safeguarded. There was a financial boost when two Bath women, Stella Pearce and Martha Inskip, took legal action to force Avon County Council to pay back rent for its occupancy of almost 2 decades. Thanks to these and other committed volunteers, the organisation enjoyed a renaissance. A new Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution charity was set up in 1992 with 400 members and new trustees, and Bath City Council helped fund building renovations and rented office space. For the past 3 decades, the organisation has continued to promote science, literature and the arts through exhibitions, talks and activities targeted at all ages, to host many local societies and interest groups, to welcome visitors from academic researchers to royal guests, and to encourage original research. Around 150 public talks take place each year, ranging from architecture and astronomy to world affairs, philosophy and poetry. Many are live-streamed and later published on YouTube. The institution is recognised as an accredited museum. Objects go on display every year in free exhibitions at Queen Square, and the collection's treasures still have much to offer science, such as revealing anatomical details of the fossil heart of an early fish or the brain case of an ichthyosaur, as this 3D scan demonstrates. Loans from the collection continue to support scientific and cultural institutions, from ichthyosaurs at the National Museum of Wales to exhibits at Bristol Museum, the Roman Baths Museum, No. 1 Royal Crescent and Bath Abbey. Now, as the institution enters its 3rd century in robust health, its mission remains as important as the day it was founded, to enrich the cultural life of Bath and the wider world, and to promote the joy of learning among new generations of the curious. Truly inspiring minds since 1824.
Now it's time to come on to the main event. You heard in the video how the institution was almost doomed until a few people got together and decided that they would save it. How they did that is what Michael King is going to be telling us about tonight, and he played an important part. Michael was born in Bath. He became a lawyer at our former neighbours in Queen Square, Stone King. He was there for 40 years in London and in Bath, and he became partner and chairman, and his work was primarily in charities and the education sector. He was a founder member of the Charity Law Association, of which he became chairman, and he co-wrote the textbook on the 2006 Charities Act. So he's clearly a distinguished expert. He retired as a solicitor, but he now works as an accredited mediator, and his company, Queen Square Advisory, is working principally in the voluntary sector. He's been a governor of distinguished schools and a trustee of several charities. And 7 times, the Charity Commission have helicoptered him into charities that were in difficulties to put them straight. However, when he was a trustee here, everything was in good order, I think. He was the first secretary of the Friends of Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution before its revival 30 years ago. And then he became a trustee of this charity. So let's welcome him to tell us how it was all saved. Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and good evening to everybody, including those online. But what a legacy has been formed over 200 years. The relaunch of the BRLSI, I know a lot of people call it BRLSI. I've never been able to call it BRLSI. For me, it was always the BRLSI, or we can call it the institution if you like. The relaunch is a small milestone in the route to the bicentenary. But I've been asked to tell you what a few of us achieved 30 years ago. 200 years of continued existence is not the longest in Bath. Look at the Abbey, look at St. John's Hospital, look at Queen Square itself. But it is significant and very much to be celebrated. I've got to start with a memory warning. That what I have to say is partly drawn from memory, and that while I can remember instances in childhood, such as tipping my little brother's pram over or causing my father's car to go for a swim in our pond, my more recent memories may not be entirely accurate. As our late Queen once said, recollections may vary, and there are a few people in this room who were around at the time. So if you have a different perception of this great institution in the 1980s and 90s, do please correct me later, or indeed with the chairman's permission at any time. That said, I have been able to cross-reference my recollections with an excellent short history of the BRLSI, which was written by written by Elizabeth M. Vincent, and is very well worth reading, indeed. So in my youth, I must have passed this side of Queen Square hundreds of times. It was largely visited as the reference library, which was housed on the ground floor here, and seemed to me to be a quiet retreat for the elderly. I won't say unshaven because they're ladies as well, but the elderly reading newspapers. I didn't know its history from the early years of the 19th century, nor anything about its collections. Of course, it had then, as now, museum described uninvitingly above the door of number 18. But there were plenty of other museums in Bath that I knew, and I certainly never asked myself what this museum had to offer in the 1970s, 1980s, etc. When Avon County Council was created in 1974, it had taken over 16 to 18 Queen Square and its contents from the then trustee, who was Bath City Council, as part of the library service. Now, Avon hoped to keep the collections in mothballs simply because there was no budget. to cover the costs of making them available to the public, which was estimated then at £3,000 a month. Roger Vaughan was the keeper of collections, and despite the pleas of Sam Hunt, that some of you will remember, director of area museums for the Southwest, Roger had his contract terminated in December 1990. This then was the background of which I knew nothing, although prompted by Betty Suchar, I've recently discovered from family papers that my great-grandfather, Austin Joseph King, another solicitor, was secretary of the Bath Literary and Philosophical Society for 20 years from 1877. And he gave lectures at the institution as diverse as Government by Proclamation by James I, the Monks of Bath in the 13th and 14th centuries, and the use and abuse of hand cameras. Would he now be speaking about the use and abuse of social media? So into my life in early 1988 comes Carl Jaeger. I had never met Carl, but he was often featured in our local rag, the Evening Chronicle, as a supporter of arts, a rather wacky American who lived in Lansdowne Crescent, and the owner for the time being of a preschool named Jabberwocky, which operated in the Old Red House, part of the bakery system, in New Bond Street. There'll be a prize later if you tell me who the current occupiers of the Old Red House are. I had heard, he had heard that I knew a little bit about charity law and asked if I could advise him on the constitution of the BRLSI and also whether Avon could be persuaded to hand over trusteeship to a more local group. I agreed to advise professionally, but after a month, I realized there was no one to pay my modest, or at least my firm's modest fees. So I suggested that I work without charge, and we set up the Friends of the BRLSI. I became the totally self-appointed secretary in order to keep Carl in control, and Carl was chairman, and we were blessed with the practical assistance of Brenda Vickery Finch, his mother-in-law, and one Bob Draper, whom most of you in this room will know and remember. For the next couple of years, we were just one of 3 pressure groups clamoring to revive the institution, or the Institute, as Carl always called it. I expect we were at best an annoyance to Avon County Council, who were at that point more concerned with the serious worry of funding libraries, who isn't even today. I think they saw what was here as an eclectic collection of old bones. I do recall at an early meeting in the pump room, it must have been in about 1989, it became clear to me that there were quite a few people in the audience who knew much more about Hastings Elwyn, Edward Barlow, Leonard Jennings, and no doubt the Duncan family, and other founders of the institution than did Carl or I. We realized straight away we had to be more inclusive of those with that knowledge, not least the Bath Geological Society, whose secretary was Bob Whitaker, later a trustee, who ticked me off for saying that the collections were of national importance. No, Michael, international importance. The University of Bath were, we discovered, also interested, but at the time, the allegations, doubtless overstated, was that they wanted to take sole control of the institution's assets, use the Queen Square premises for their own purposes, and move the collections up to Clapperton Down. Long before I became involved, the management of this charity had reached the collective ears of the charity commissioners for England and Wales. But at that time, they were a rather reactive group rather than investigative as they are now. And the strong powers to act for the protection of charities were yet to be introduced in the 1993 Charities Act. John Carrico, the senior lawyer at the Commission, once told me that the correspondence about the BRLSI, if stacked together, would be twice his height. John was blind, and everything had to be read to him by his assistant Hilary. He naturally had a phenomenal memory and had huge intelligence. With background encouragement from John Claricote and growing enthusiasm from supporters, we began the task of talking to others interested in repatriating control of the institution as we saw it from Bristol to Bath. Oh, I love Bristol dearly, but it's not like Bath. Not the same as Bath. It was slow work, this. The ability to tell decision makers that the Friends of the BRLSI had got together over 100 members did, however, allow us to be considered seriously by the Charity Commission and also by the likes of another great supporter, Chris Patten, then Bath's MP, and he encouraged Bath University and the City Council to work with us. I recall being down at the Charity Commission's Taunton office one day on other business and spoke to Stephen Slack, a senior lawyer at the Commission. John Claricote had, I think with some relief, passed the files relating to the BRLSI to Stephen. And he told me that the Commission's view was that there was a large number of worthy and articulate citizens in Bath with many and varied views, but little consensus. Does that ring any bells? He advised us that unless we could bring these citizens together to speak as far as possible with one voice, there would be no support from Avon or from the Commission to transfer the trusteeship. I'm going to take a quick look at the various groups who were interested in the institution, starting first with the Bath Society. That was a pressure group housed down the road at Green Park Station, which was run by a vociferous campaigner on all sorts of planning and heritage matters named Major Anthony Crombie. Does that ring a bell with someone? The society had in the, he was sometimes known as the Mad Major, that's much, I'll leave that aside. The society had in the late 1980s established the Working Party for the Re-establishment of the Bath RLSI. Its chairman was Fitzroy Lord Raglan. He very helpfully announced that various groups interested in the BRLSI needed to work together. One member of the society who joined the Friends was Dr. David Dunlop, a radiologist at the RUH, and he was the future first chairman of the trustees of the BRLSI, a good man. At a meeting of the pump room, in the pump room on 12th December 1991, the Friends proposed the setting up of a steering group to try to broker an agreement with Avon County and with anybody else who had an interest in the BRLSI. In the following month, that steering group, by then consisting of the Friends, the members of the Bath Society's Working Party, met with officers of Avon, but their line was, look, we have no money, do you have? In any event, before handing over the institution to you lot, we want to see a business plan, and we want to see that you have some credibility. A bit difficult to start with. At their meeting on the 20th of January 1992, Avon's Community and Leisure Committee sensed that they had had enough of constant clamour from Bath, and as an alternative to closing down the charity and dispersing the collections, they decided to look at the option of doing a deal with the Bath Society, the BRLSI Friends, and eventually with Bath University. The committee decided, or said that they would allow 3 months for a deal to be achieved, not a long time, we were still starting. So the next group is the University of Bath. As I've already mentioned, the university had other ideas for the institution, one of which was, allegedly, to move the collections to Claverton Down into what David Dunlop called a bunker, but could well have been the then unfilled stone mines. That does sound somewhat dramatic, but at the time, the university was very conscious that it had little foothold in the city. Town and gown did not seem to gel. 16 to 18 Queen Square might usefully have become the city's university base. We had to point out that coming together was unlikely to happen if the university was seen to be running off with the crown jewels, that's the collections. Our then MP, Chris Patten, who had given us a lot of background help since 1989, told us that we must have a dialogue with the university. And we did as Chris suggested, and by the spring of 1992, a group of shadow trustees was formed, essentially 3 from the university, 3 from the Friends, and 3 from Bath Society. And they met for the first time at 13 Queen Square, which is then my office, on the 24th of April of 1992. I want to mention a fourth group, which is the Association for Membership of the BRLSI. This was established by Stella Pearce and Martha Inskip, who you saw on the film, but actually paid for by Dr. Dorothy Speed. These ladies were rightly keen to establish a membership for the institution because the lack of that had caused the institution's trustees to hand over control to the probably reluctant mayor and corporation of the citizens of the city of Bath. That was in 1930. However, the Association for Membership had significant concerns about the way in which firstly Bath Corporation and later Avon County Council had mishandled trusteeship of the institution during the previous 40 years. They were very untrusting of the new groups who had set themselves up, as they saw it, to re-establish it. In consequence, the Association for Membership found it more than a little difficult to countenance the idea that we, the shadow trustees, should broker a deal with Avon, as suggested by the Charity Commission and Chris Patton. Be that as it may, the 3 ladies, Dorothy, Stella, and Martha, had, through careful scholarship and research, discovered the Podium Agreement. This was an agreement between Avon County Council and Bath City Council, dated 28th November 1987, under which the collections would purportedly be transferred to the then public library in Bridge Street, which now houses the Victoria Art Gallery, while the library would be rehoused in its present premises above what is now Waitrose. That's where it is at the moment. Obviously, all this needed funding, and the proceeds of sale of 16 to 18 Queen Square could have been very useful in this context. There was a third party to the Podium Agreement, a company established by Bath City Council called Cleverfix Limited, and its very name gave succor to the conspiracy theorists. In fact, the Podium Agreement was a red herring because the Charity Commission would never have allowed, would never have consented to the sale of 16 to 18 Queen Square, other than unless it was proved to be of benefit to the charity. Stella, Dorothy, and Martha were highly intelligent and well-informed, but they were somewhat hampered by their absolute refusal to work with Avon or Bath authorities. Indeed, I was called to a meeting at the circus one day to find Stella sitting on the staircase outside the meeting room door. I said, well, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm supposed to be at the meeting, but I can't face being part of the discussion about the institution with Bath City Council personnel, but I don't want to say that I'd left the building. Much later on, the 3 ladies rendered a significant service to the institution, and I'll refer to that later. But for the time being, we were somewhat at cross purposes. So the shadow trustees, having met as a body on the 24th of April, 1992, subsequently told Avon and the Charity Commission that they were willing and able to take on the responsibility of the BRLSI, and they called a meeting of potential members at Green Park, again in the Bath Society's premises. And that was on the 1st of July, 1992. And we announced that we'd put a group together which would comprise the following, and I'll read out the names. Some of you may be well aware of the names. Professor Rodney Quayle, who was the Vice-Chancellor of the university. Richard Mordett, sometimes known as Mordett the Audit, who was the Director of Finance, and Professor Angus Buchanan, Director of the Centre for History of Technology at the university. There were 6 members of the original steering group. There was Edgar Avon, Chairman of the Bath Geological Society, Rodney Cross, who's just died, and a good man, Cross Engineering, or Cross Manufacturing, I think he ran. John Skipper, a retired accountant, Bob Whitaker, whom I've mentioned, who was also an advisor to on archaeology to the National Trust. Dr. David Dunlop, whom I've mentioned, and little me. Essentially, we're a mixture of Bath Society and Friends of the BRLSI. This group of shadow trustees or interim trustees was, I admit, self-appointed, albeit they were drawn from Friends, Bath Society, and the university. As I say, this did not please everyone, not least the ladies of the Association for Membership of the BRLSI, or indeed the Friends chairman, Carl Jaeger. In truth, some of those who shouted loudest had done a great job in awakening the people of Bath to the possible loss of their institution, but they were not necessarily the right people to give confidence to Avon and the Commission that they could take forward such a venerable but failing institution in a coalition of varied interests, experience, and skills. So we impressed upon interested parties at our July 1992 meeting the need to work together to persuade Avon County Council and the Charity Commission that we were indeed a fit group of people to take on the trusteeship of this much neglected institution. We were challenged by Avon to do three things: to prepare a business plan, to report on the viability of the BRLSI at a meeting, a subsequent meeting, 23rd of November of 1992, of Avon County Council Community Leisure Committee, the library service, in other words. And in due course, we had to establish a new vehicle for the institution. Not everybody appreciated the efforts of those of us who were doing our level best to repatriate control from Bristol. Let me read you this undated letter from one Mr. Gareth Morgan, who wrote something addressed to the trustees of the BRLSI, which is handed on to me for some reason. Dear Sir, I'm afraid I have no interest in listening to the BRLSI talking endlessly about the BRLSI, gratifying as it must be to the trustees. Thank you all the same for the invitation. If the BRLSI should ever show any interest in science or literature or anything other than the BRLSI, please let me know. If it is going to be indefinitely contemplating its own navel, then please strike me off your mailing list. No offense, which you misspelled. Yours, Gareth Morgan. I can't remember my reply, but it must have been somewhere along the lines of here. So then the new Board of Trustees, it had been decided in our inaugural meeting in 1992 of the interim trustees that the future composition of the new trustee board should be as broad as possible to give Avon and indeed the Charity Commission a degree of security. They were not handing the institution over to a dysfunctional group of single issue members. So then the original 16 trustees, I don't know whether Ian, where is it going? Oh, sorry. I don't know whether you still have 16 trustees or maybe you have 23 or no. 16. Yeah. Well, it seemed a good idea at the time, 16. But those originally, the trustees or directors of BRLSI Trustees, the company, were four nominated by national bodies: the British Academy, the British Museum, the Royal Society, and the Geological Society, / Geologists Association. Four came from local academia, namely three from the University of Bath and one from BCHE. Now, of course, Bath Spa University. Things move on, don't they? One was from the Area Museum Service for the Southwest, two from local authorities, and five from the elected members. As you well know, the number of elected members has over time risen, and that's very sensible. We always knew that most of the work on the trustee board would be done by elected members, and it was necessary to provide a sense of reassurance to those who might be disposed to help us. So that's why we had those many nominated trustees. We spoke early on of the institution as being our city's literary and scientific village hall, but we formally had to identify its policies, and these were the financial organization and independence, protection of the collections, making them in part available to the public and in whole available to scholars, the provision of a curator for the collections. You can tick off things that have happened. Acting as a secretariat and centre for lectures within the ambit of the institution's wide objects, provision of a meeting room, reception, library, and a small museum area, storage, kitchen and cafeteria, an office and plant. Accepting that, as we had to, the possible need to let or even sell some or all of 16 to 18 Queen Square in order to fund the institution, I should say that at the time I had absolutely no idea that my firm would for a decade be occupying upstairs 40% of this building as commercial tenants, and therefore making a major contribution to the BRLSI's costs. Finally, we wanted, we sought an exception to the need to consider finding an alternative home for some of the collections in order to reduce expenditure, but not, of course, the Moore and Jennings collections, which were specific to Bath. Indeed, I think some of the collections had gone, whether they still are, had gone to Cardiff. Still are. I know I sat at with somebody in this room at a very nice desk, which he told me had come from the BRLSI. That's in the Guildhall. Whether it's still there, I don't know. The Cardiff office of Chartered Accountants PKF were instructed in May to collate information and prepare a business plan on the assumption that these various policies would be pursued. The cost of that was £12,000 plus VAT. We had no money, but we managed to obtain it from Bath City Council, and I will thank somebody later in this room who actually engineered that. How, I don't know, but people in local authorities did at the time have little pots of money they could get their hands on. PKF presented an interim report to say that even if we could try to pursue all those policies, insufficient capital and revenue would be produced even by selling off one of the three buildings, 16, 17 and 18 Queen Square, and letting some of the floors of the remaining two buildings. This was a real worry to us, as you can imagine. In the event, a meeting took place in November 1992 between the interim trustees and Dennis Jenkins Evans, the county solicitor, and David Prattley, then Director of Leisure and Tourist Services for Bath. At that meeting, it was agreed that they would recommend to Avon the transfer of trusteeship of the building and its collections on the 31st of March 1993. That was beginnings of a way forward. Recording the meeting of the Avon Community Leisure Committee on the 23rd of November 1992, there are two interesting comments which I want to share with you. First was, local groups have undergone a facelift and had attracted the right people to the shadow trustees, including the University of Bath. The second was, this has been on the agenda for so long, it will really be missed. Although the interim trustees took over in April 1993, the formal transfer only took effect with the incorporation of BRLSI Trustees, the new company. And that took place on the 27th of September 1993. And the appointment of that company as the sole trustee of the institution was by a scheme of the Charity Commission. The scheme is like an order of the Charity Commission, dated 29th September 1993. Things began to happen quite quickly. Now, perhaps not unnaturally in such situations, there's ever distrust. A man, or it could be a woman, is not always a prophet in his own land. And there were rumblings that in some way the deal which had been done had not resulted in the property being transferred. Maybe it had been handed over, though it was never said to my face, to that Michael King and a few unelected friends. So we asked a retired solicitor, Graham Harrison, who lived in Causton, to look at the deeds and the proposed transfer to provide an independent confirmation that the new trustee board had done what it said and had achieved the transfer to a new corporate trustee, the BRLSI trustees. Now, I want to move on to the restoration of the building. It has to be said that the then Bath City Council were extremely helpful in providing financial help with the business plan and ongoing support and advice, even to the extent of assistance in the relocation of the assistants if we needed to go down that route. We had to think about it. Though we loved this 16 to 18 Queen Square, it wasn't absolutely necessary that it should be here. It couldn't be anywhere in Bath. But the City Council's most important contribution came in terms of the substantial refurbishment of this building. Our surveyor was Bob Goodman, whom some of you know. He's been a councillor of this city. Bob said that the roof was like a colander that had holes in it. The basement was even damper, and the boilers were museum pieces in their own right. For safety reasons, we obviously needed a new access. So the works included the new access to number 16, because the current access, where below which you have the museum sign, that's number 18. The access you all use nowadays was not there. So that was the other thing, that the bridge rising over the area and the new entrance also, I have to say, was paid for by Bath City Council. Now, much credit is due then to the Chief Executive of Bath, Clive Abbott, who's sitting in the third row back and may like to speak later. He came up with some money from something called the Government Training Scheme, which I think his wife was involved, but we needn't go into that. And it needed premises in which the unemployed youth of Bath could receive vocational training, particularly in IT, a new concept then. The deal reached was that the Bath City Council would pay for the cost of the building works to a limit of £250,000, £250,000, following which the council would be granted a 7-year lease at the rent of £10,000. I've lost count of the number of times I later had to explain to new trustees over time and to doubting members why it was we had the stupidity to agree to let over half the building for that length of time to the local authority for a mere £10,000 per annum. Well, despite Bob Goodman's careful monitoring of costs, the final bill was well in excess of £250,000. And we were somewhat exercised about the possibility of the City Council asking us to repay the balance. There was for several years a provision in our accounts for a 5-figure sum, just in case the City Council might knock on the door and say, you owe us some money. So we reopened the institution in April 1993 with an exhibition of a small part of the collections in the Moor Room. The exhibition was called Here Be Dragons, on the theme of dinosaurs, which was all the rage at the time, following the release of the blockbuster Jurassic Park that year. I'm not sure it brought us in any money, but at least it made a bit of a splash. We spent a great deal of time on the logo, designed for us by David Beaujard. You see in the middle of the 200, that's the logo. It was designed by David Beaujard and his art students from what later from BCHE, that later Bath Spa University. There was much debate about what the logo meant. We did debate serious things, you see. I thought it was simply a pen drawing a circle at the end of the beginning, perhaps. To some, it was a pen poised over an old-fashioned inkwell, while to others, it was clearly a flame in a lamp to enlighten minds. We always had the view of the need to create a large membership which would provide ongoing support, because the lack of ongoing support really caused the institution almost to die off in the 1930s. And it's interesting to note that in 1996, we had 400 members. Now there are 800, which is terrific, but to get to 400 when it was not doing the things it does today was something. We're still not out of the wood financially, and in consequence, the Moor Room was let to a warship design company, which is the sort of thing you do in Bath, and other parts of the building were sublet to professional organisations. I just want to turn to the legacy of the three ladies, Stella, Martha, and Dorothy. During the negotiations with Avon, there was mention of the need for the county council to pay back rent for the use of the 16 to 18 Queen Square, which they'd had as part of the county's library service, as well as a contribution to dilapidations in the building during their watch. I mentioned that the roof was like a colander. I recall that on making one such request at a meeting in the ghastly Avon House, which is in the Haymarket, is now a hotel, I think. It's about the one skyscraper in the bottom of Bristol. The Avon chief executive summarily showed me the door and said, if we decided to push the point, that would be the end of the meeting. So we decided not to push the point and continue the battle. So we wanted to win the war, not that particular battle. Well, Avon's 22 years of existence came to an end in April 1996. And the sum reflecting the county's potential liabilities was placed in the hands of the successor authorities, Bristol and Bath. The three ladies, funded by Dorothy Speed, started a legal action, and they succeeded in a settlement of £600,000, gaining payment from Avon for what it had failed to pay for the library service space and the dilapidations resulting from their watch. This has been an extremely valuable legacy. So even though we couldn't include them in the trusteeship at the time, this is what they were able to do. I just want to mention a few people who have assisted us over this period, and there will be many others, and no doubt there will be some here who are not mentioned, but I will mention the following. Brenda Vickery Finch, Carl Yeager's mother-in-law. She was for many years the administrator here. Carl Yeager, one of the countless legions of Bath's adopted sons and daughters who come to our city and made a difference, even though he could never call it other than the Institute. There was Fitzroy Lord Raglan, and he, as chairman of the Bath Society, ensured that the Friends and had another respected group with whom to work. He'd introduced David Dunlop, the first chairman of the interim trustees of the new board. Victor Suchard, Betty's husband, who was the ultimate convener of the BRLSI's groups, which grew like topsy and almost immediately. John Skipper was our first treasurer. Peter Ford, who was brilliant at introducing science to children. Have you got your steam and your...
Well, not on me.
Not on you.
I still give them.
Bob Whittaker, who ran our collection subcommittee, had huge knowledge of the collections and their whereabouts. Rodney Cross, who's died recently, Cross Manufacturing, hugely helpful. Chris Patton, MP, who unlocked several doors, not least at the university and Bath City Council. His experience with the BRLSI may have been useful experience in preparation for his roles under fire as the last governor of Hong Kong and chairmanship of the BBC. Although he's here, I will mention Clive Abbott, the chief executive of Bath at the time, who produced the money to re-roof and refurbish the building, as well as the creation of the new entrance. It ought to be called the Abbott entrance, I think. I'll leave that with you. A good friend of mine, Dr. Roger Rolls, Bath GP, who was a notable historian of Bath, and he encouraged us to keep the institution in existence. Rob Randall, who's been mentioned this evening, from my point of view, he was the one who ran the newsletter for many years, but he was also worked as a volunteer latterly with Matt in the basement here, and was a guardian of our activities, our archives, and no doubt of much else. Linda Wigley was our first curator following Ron Pickford, who was mentioned on the film. Professor Rodney Quayle, some of you will remember, he was the Vice Chancellor of Bath University and gave us immense support. And I have to say, my secretary, Margie Ramsey, who still lives in Bath, in pre-email days, she typed countless missives, minutes, reports, and letters, as well as ensuring that I was where I should be at any particular time. Mickey Brown, who with Bob Draper visited literary and scientific institutions throughout the country to find out whether they'd survived, how they were funded, what they were doing. And we celebrated in this room last October, well, it's next door, last October, the amazing Bob Draper, who for 35 years and more carried the institution along, sometimes single-handed, keeping us up to date with events, fixing light bulbs, working behind the scenes. He was caretaker when we had none. He effectively set up our website, was our resource for redundant electronic equipment for the university.
Yeah.
We at the time, there was one telephone in this building. That was all. I've told successive vice-chancellors that Bob, usually unknown to them, was one of Bath University's best ambassadors. The time and my memory have not allowed me to mention many more, but the BRLSI is very much alive and is in their debt. Looking at the subjects of the 10 talks advertised for this month, ranging from the 19th century scientist and polymath Mary Somerville to the Cuban Missile Crisis in the mid-20th century, I tend to think that our wish to restore and recreate Bath's literary and scientific institution, Village Hall, has been more than achieved. So my congratulations to the BRLSI trustees and directors and members on achieving 2 centuries and continuing to make such a difference to life in Bath and nationally. Take questions, or people might like to make points, especially those I've mentioned.
It would be terrific to have some questions and to have some observations from those who were in the room at the time. Has anybody got any questions?
Because we had a question.
Because we're online.
You said you were going to ask.
No, I wasn't going to ask. No, I wanted people to ask.
In your talk, you said you were going to ask, what is the current building that was the thing that Carl Yeager had?
Oh, the old Red House. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Can I repeat for those online? There's only one microphone.
I think it was Laura Ashley. It was later, after the old Red House. It was Laura and Jabberwock. It was Laura Ashley. That's where it is, in New Bond Street.
Okay. Has anybody got any? Yes.
Well, as you mentioned, I was one of the shadow.
You want to come to the?
Yeah. I'll give a speech. Well, not a short one.
Come along, and then you'll be in the camera.
Oh, I'm on the box. Yeah. I was one of the shadow trustees, and I remember we used to have quite a few meetings, which generally began with a rant from Stella Pierce for about 20 minutes. I could never quite understand what a rant was about, almost as if it was somehow setting up the new BRLSI was an insult to her late husband. Now, I can never quite work out the connection. Anyway, she would then disappear in sort of high dudgeon, I think it would be a Jane Austen expression. And after that, we had about another 2-hour sensible meeting. I seem to recall that. And something shortly after, I'd worked most of the 1990s in University of BRLSI in South Africa at the heart of apartheid. I came back to Britain, and I read in the Times about the Highgate Literary and Philosophical Society, which looked to me as something which we ought to try and emulate. Now, it was interesting for me because I came up from, I was born in North London, and my uncle, who was killed in the war, went to Highgate. And if I hadn't passed my 11 plus and gone to a grammar school for nothing, I would have gone to Highgate at great expense to my parents. Anyway, Bob and I went up on one at a time, and that began our contact with the Association of the Independent Libraries. And there's all sorts of places all over the country. I mean, Highgate is one, but there's places like Portico in Manchester. There's a famous one in Leeds, a one in Newcastle. I mean, all over the country. There's some in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. We discovered also that there are a lot overseas, particularly in Australia. And in 2008, Bob and I were the sort of main organisers of the First World International Conference on Museums and Literary Societies. And we had a very successful meeting. and a lot came from Australia, including Jim Loudon, who some of you might remember, and his daughter Bronwyn, and it was very successful. So one thing I would say about a BRLSI was about the only thing I've been involved in my life which has worked out to be much more successful than I ever thought it would be. So congratulations, we're still here. I hope I will be along for part at least of the first part of the 300, to go towards 300. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Sure. Has anybody else got a question or an observation? I don't know if there's anything online. No. I mean, it's a great evening for looking back, is it not? And to reflect on just how close this institution came to not existing. There are hundreds of others around the country that failed to make it, and a few that are still around, and we're one of them. So I think that's fantastic.
I just wonder whether Stephen or Clive would like to add anything, because you were very much involved. You better come up to here.
Just to say that
you can be heard on you've got to be heard online.
Oh, okay. Well, back in the early 1990s, it was obvious that something needed to be done, and because Avon was very much on the way out long before local government reorganisation and the Bannerman Commission reported. There were two fledgling town councils, Humberside and Avon, that were not going to make it. They'd only been started in 1974. So poor old Avon was doomed. And of course, at that time, Avon did have some very substantial financial problems. It was quite obvious that unless there was a decisive intervention, things wouldn't really work out. Anyway, I can't remember exactly how it was achieved, but the important thing was to get the right result. It was smoke and mirrors, really, as it very often is the case. But actually, it was a respectable. There was a respectable bit of background, but for the record, which is that in a curious way, the government training scheme came to the budget came to the rescue. At that time, the government was funding local authorities who took the initiative of running training schemes for local people, either they were unemployed or very often young people who've never actually been in work. And there was a particular group I seem to remember that if people hadn't been in work for 6 months, there was a special effort to try to do something there. So we had, in Bath City Council, we had a training wing, an excellent manager, and she got local people organised and people came along, but it had to be funded, and that was where the government funding scheme came in. And that was an important part of it. And the other part was that the City Council took the initiative and accepted advice from those of us who were there to advise that this was a really important Bath institution which needed to be saved and could be saved with enough drive. But it wasn't just a Bath institution. I think Michael has made the point, and the last speaker made the point. It's part of a network of really important 19th century institutions, which some could see as the forerunner, what then became the university. Because if you think of the dates, the institutions which then made up what has now become a number of universities was very much a 19th century phenomenon. For example, the big civic universities, which appeared in the early 20th century, the five big civics. Before that, were a single university called the Victoria University, which people forget. And then that spiraled out into Bristol, Leeds, Newcastle, Manchester, and Sheffield.
Yeah, Manchester celebrated its 200th anniversary this year. And it was, I mean, I was at Manchester for a while, and it was, you had the Victoria University of Manchester, sometimes known as Owens College, as the seat from the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology.
I think the Victoria University, if I recall, was based in Manchester, but it had these five fingers of these other cities, which then got to. So it was really almost a question of keeping the flame alive. Initially reference to Mary Somerville, who's the subject of a lecture, and what she did and achieved, because it was in the late 1870s, the 1880s, you had the first two women's colleges, Girton and Somerville, and so it's all part of a story. Anyway, back to and finally to 1993. I don't remember all the details. It was all done very correctly, but at the same time, it needed a bit of imagination. I think Michael mentioned that word in his talk. There was a bit of imagination. You could make a lot of things happen, and it was, as they say, a team effort. Was.
The Director of Heritage of Bath ought to say something.
Welcome.
Former. Better introduce yourself, Stephen.
I'm the former. I used to be head of heritage services in Bath and North East Somerset Council. I was around at the time of the transition, and I came to Bath in 1900 and frozen to death, 1980 as the curator of the Roman Baths. And towards the end of the 80s, I started getting messages that there were plans for the BRLSI to revive it. But it seemed to me it was all heading in the wrong direction. And there was this issue of Clever Fix Limited at the podium and so on. And I inadvertently got interviewed and promoted to be Assistant Director of Leisure and Tourism, and took responsibility not just for the Roman Baths, for the Victoria Art Gallery Museum of Costume. But the gallery at that time was on the upper floor only. It was built as a purpose-built gallery. The library moved in on a temporary basis in 1926. And so if any librarian mentioned anything was overdue to me, they got fairly short shrift. But the plan was, yes, to put the Geology Museum in the basement of the gallery, create the first floor where the Lending Library had been into a kind of city visitor centre, and keep the gallery upstairs. And I just felt that this was morally dubious to misappropriate the Geology Museum and be party to all of that. And so I went out on a limb and said to my then director, Dennis Easterby, that I didn't think this was a good idea. And I thought we ought to turn the building into a first-class art gallery, and that please may I be on the little working group that's being set up for the re-establishment of the BRLSI. And he said, talk to the chief executive. So I talked to Clive, and Clive said, yes, please go on that working group. I do remember Stella Pearce. I still bear the scars because I worked for the council. But actually, she was absolutely right. Martha Oliver, she reverted to her maiden name, Martha Inskip, was a formidable mind. She had worked at Bletchley Park in the war, and she had the most wonderfully analytical mind. She turned into a superb archivist as well. She had that kind of forensic mind that get right inside an issue, and she was not to be messed with. And it was to her credit and that of the other ladies, really, that the whole thing came through. Michael's been very modest about his role, but actually Michael held it all together and steered a steady course. And with that, with the, I have to say, the ongoing support from Clive and the City Council, it set a fair sail for the future.
The third lady, I think, had been governor of Holloway Women's Prison. Is that right? Anyone know that? Well, I think that was the case. Anyway, that gives you some idea about how formidable they were. Not to be messed with.
Well, it's nearly International Women's Week, isn't it? So isn't it great to hear all this? Has anybody else got anything else to say? Because if not, I'd really like to thank Michael for casting quite an important light on what happened a long time before I ever came to Bath, and an important part in the story of this institution. So, Michael, thank you very much for sharing that with us. Thank you.